Welcome back, everybody. We're on Days of Noah 14. This was originally supposed to be part of 13, but it got too long, so it's now number 14, and it also involves quite a bit of dark stuff. Not all these presentations are always involving a lot of satanic stuff. Some of them will not. But for the ones that do, the Holy Spirit has put it on my heart that I should pray before those lectures, because we're looking at a lot of occult symbolism and a lot of charged images, and we want to protect ourselves with the Holy Spirit. So, dear Lord, we thank you and praise you for another day, and I just ask you to be present as we move forward with these presentations. I pray over these presentations. I pray that you are with me as I communicate these things online. And I ask you to bless those who are watching, and I ask you to protect them, protect their mind and their hearts and their souls from any of these images and any of these concepts. And may you allow this information to be edifying to them in such a way that their eyes are open to the spirit realm and they're able to see and understand what's really going on in this world. And Lord, I pray that you will bring whoever you want to come watch these videos. I have no control over who's going to be watching them, and so I'm trying to be obedient by making them, and then I release it to the Holy Spirit to draw the people that you want to come and watch them. And we thank you and praise you in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So as usual, I want to do a review, mainly because I have friends and different people who say that they just don't have time to watch them all, and they kind of bounce around, and you never know which one they're going to land on. And I don't blame them. I don't have time to watch hours and hours of video either. And so the reviews are helpful for people who have missed 2 or 3 or 4 lectures. So quickly, I usually use Aleister Crowley as my start point because he was kind of the father of all this. It goes back much further than him, but he's the main one in the last 100 years who's helped precipitate this spirit of Antichrist. And we know that he left his Christian roots. He got into Eastern mysticism. He began dabbling in the occult. And before you knew it, he was full-fledged into witchcraft, ceremonial magic. He ended up going to the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt for his honeymoon. And he hooked up with a supernatural spirit of Horus, who's the sun god. Also, now we know that that's Lucifer, the light bearer. And from there, he supernaturally dictated the Book of the Law, which was a charged document that described the next 100 years and how they would bring in this new age, this new era, if you will, of human evolution, where mankind no longer needs to follow the Bible. They no longer need to be concerned with sin. They no longer need to be concerned with being altruistic towards others. And it really kind of is summarized by one concept, which is do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. And we end up watching that maxim be played out over the decades to come, especially, for example, during the 60s, when we start seeing these expressions such as, if it feels good, do it, and you only live once, and the whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll movement. Now, Aleister Crowley, the same spirit that was working through him, got passed down, because that's how it works. So he started the Church of Thelema, which drew in the occultist Jack Parsons in the late 30s and early 40s. Now, Jack Parsons was he was a nuclear physicist. He helped start Jet Propulsion's laboratory. He helped, was one of the fathers of NASA. And him and Ron Hubbard, who was coming out of the Air Force at that time, or the Navy, I can't remember, maybe it was the Navy he was coming out of. These two hooked up with each other and became roommates and performed the Babylon working ritual, which was a sex magic ritual where they opened up a doorway and allowed the spirit of Babylon come into our plane of existence. And this was the intention of this was to bring in the spirit of Babylon from the book of Revelations. Now that shouldn't be surprising because they were studying Crowley's work, and Crowley identified with himself as Master Therion, which is the beast from the book of Revelations, and his personal identification number was 666. So these guys are just, this same Antichrist spirit is now working in them. And as a consequence of this Babylon working ritual, we see the beginning of the UFO movement. We see the Roswell incident happen the following year. Marjorie Cameron comes onto the scene, and she is doing blood rituals and seeing UFOs. And then eventually she moves to San Francisco after Jack Parsons dies, and she starts running with a very eclectic group, including Kenneth Anger, who is also into the Church of Thelema. He's producing movies like Lucifer Rising and Invocation of My Demon Brother, which are highly satanic movies based on Crowleyan principles, and he recruits musicians to come and play in those for the movies. People like Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones, who we'll find out later were members of the Process Church, which we'll get into. And so, he has a great influence on Hollywood. He's also associated with Anton LaVey, who's part of the Church of Satan, who also had a lot of famous movie stars in his church, and he dictated the Satanic Bible, which would be a contemporary writing of the Book of the Law. And so we see how many layers there are. Marjorie Cameron ends up also spending time with George Van Tassel, who is responsible for the UFO conventions of the 50s and 60s, which we haven't discussed yet. We'll get into him in a later time. So you see all this overlap of the occult, Aleister Crowley, witchcraft, and ufology. Meanwhile, Ron Hubbard ends up dictating the concept of Dianetics, which is a book of psychology, just a few years after the Babylon working ritual, and then eventually this turns into Scientology, the religion, in 1953. And as we established previously, it's a UFO religion based on UFO concepts and extraterrestrials. Now, we discussed how they use the electropsychometer to measure a person's spirit, and they do auditing sessions and process people in such a way that they become totally steeped in the occult. And I proposed a hypothesis or theory that it was in the process of doing these rituals in this church with the electropsychometer that people then develop this religious spirit. This is the access point in which this religious spirit comes into their life and begins to shape their mind and their will and their emotions in such a way that they totally become fooled and entrenched in these cults like Scientology. Meanwhile, we also see some splinter churches form, like Eckankar and the Church of Bleach and the Process Church, which are all churches that become worldwide renowned and become, rich and are using a lot of the same formula that Ron Hubbard used. We also discussed how Elvis Presley was steeped in the occult. His whole family, all of his children are Scientologists. The Beatles are Crowley followers and Satanists. We discussed a lot of the different bands, such as Zeppelin and The Doors, and Jim Morrison was in the occult. Basically, what you figure out is that all of these bands of the 50s and 60s and 70s were deeply in the occult. And so this is the birth of the 60s, of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll era. And really, anybody who's been around a long time will tell you, you had life before the 60s and life after. Prior to the 60s, there was a lot more innocence, there was a lot more fun, the family was a lot stronger, and Christian values were a lot stronger. But it was during the 60s that we start to see this attack on biblical principles, and in the 70s we begin to see the Bible being taken away from public school, and as a consequence we see the rise of everything from Eastern mysticism, the occult, the New Age movement, and so on. Meanwhile, we see the rise of the UFO era, which we're going to continue to discuss as we move forward. This is also the timeline where we see a lot of important movies come out. Movies like The Shining, movies like Space Odyssey 2001 in 1968, movies like Rosemary's Baby about the birth of the Antichrist. The 60s are the era where Satan really doubled down on his movement towards shaping and molding the minds of humanity across the world. Because America was the saviors of World War II, and because we became the world reserve currency, all of the rest of the world began to adopt our principles. and we began to export our witchcraft across the whole planet. And so Hollywood was not just an American situation. The entire world embraced American music and American movies, so that all of these ideologies that we've been discussing became known worldwide. And partially that you could thank this due to Ron Hubbard and Scientology, because he was able to completely brainwash Hollywood hook, line, and sinker. From here we discuss how the process church is born, how a couple of high-level Scientologists who are doing auditing sessions splintered off from the Church of Scientology and started the process church of the Final Judgement. And they also used an electropsychometer. They renamed it and repackaged it under some different ideologies, and then began using it in their own church. And this totally overwhelmed California. The majority of the people who were in the hippie movement were influenced by the process church. And what we find out is that the Manson family was part of the process church. Famous musicians such as Mick Jagger were part of the process church. We found out that David Berkowitz, the son of Sam Killer, was a splinter group off the process church. And what we're going to see and what we're going to discuss in this lecture is what I referred to as the serial killer era. This is an era that really didn't exist prior to this. You've always had people killing each other on this planet, but we never had this cult of personality where you now have this serial killer era where people are doing this for media and for fame. And so we're going to discuss that moving forward. Meanwhile, on the last one we discussed the music and how the music was forming. We know that all the 60s music was shaped and molded by the Book of the Law and Crowleyism. And we started to discuss about people like Genesis P. Orridge, who was an English magician, who was a man, transgender, who became a woman, and she was steeped in Aleister Crowley, and she began to, she was the one who invented the industrial music genre, which we're going to really get into on this specific lecture. But she helped pave the way for all of the really heavy metal, all of the electronic music, like the electric guitar and all the electronics that we see with electric synthesizers. She started the Temple of the Psychic Youth Occult Group. She started a band called Throbbing Gristle, who was one of the leading bands in the industrial music phase. And she helped birth the rave and techno era of the late 70s and early 80s that really began to manifest on this planet. And so all of this is, the same spirit has been working through all these people and all this stuff to culminate into this great delusion in the last days where mankind is so deceived that he cannot see the truth of Jesus Christ. The majority of people have fallen away from the Bible and from biblical ways. And, as the enemy continues to move forward, we're going to see how things are going to lead to this great deception. Now, currently, we're still in the past. We're still dealing with the 70s and the 80s. As these lectures go on, we're going to catch up eventually to current time, and then the lectures are going to move forward to the future and what we can expect over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years until the manifestation of the beast system comes into play in the last days. So there is a quick review. And so now we're going to move forward. Now there was a man by the name of Timothy Wiley. So I started thinking about this serial killer era. The fact that David Berkowitz was involved with the Process Church, Charles Manson. As I was studying the music, I saw that Genesis P. Orridge, a lot of her lyrics and a lot of her music was about cults and serial killers, and same thing with other people in the industrial music era who are using this electronic music. People like Marilyn Manson, who was also into serial killers. And I started thinking, obviously serial killers are very demonic. And so the same spirit that's working through the music is working through these serial killers. So I meditated on that for a while. I prayed about it, and then I felt led to do a little research. And I feel like I have, maybe stumbled on to some interesting details here. And So I'm going to share those with you, and I'll try and go through this quickly because this is a long presentation. I looked at the 25 most famous serial killers in the last 100 years, and this is more or less what I got. You have, and they're not necessarily in order of most famous, but this is just a list of 25. David Berkowitz, who we've discussed, he's the Son of Sam killer. He confessed that he was a Satan worshiper and that he was in the occult. And you know, there's all these people who don't believe in Satan, but yet we have all these people who claim to be Satan worshipers who are going out killing people. So, you know, I don't know how they could deny that when the proof is in the pudding. But basically, he belonged to a cult in the 1970s in California. And so I want you to remember where these serial killers come from and the era, the timeline that they show up. Number 2 is Edmund Kemper. Now, he was known as the Coil killer. He murdered 10 people, mostly women. He also murdered his grandparents. A lot of them were co-ed girls from university institutions that he would seduce and murder, and he was known for necrophilia. So he was a very sadistic person. After he would murder the women, he would have sex with them. And so think about the spirit that's involved in that. He's got this spirit of lust, but also he's got this spirit of death. And so those two combined end up, you know, making necrophilia, which is just one of the most horrible things to consider. But once again, it was in the 1960s in California. So there's two serial killers we see, you know, in that 60 to 70s year, 1960s to 70s era in the same location. Now, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were called the Toolbox Killers, and these guys were about as sadistic as they come. They got caught murdering 5 young women, but they claim they killed a bunch more in the 1970s. And they called them the Toolbox Killers because they had a room called the Toolbox where they used every kind of piece of machinery you can imagine on women. And they were sadomasochists. They wanted to torture women and rape them before they killed them. So they were just also highly sadistic. But notice again, California, 1970s. Then you have the Hillside Stranglers. This is between 1977 and 78. 2 cousins, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono, carried out a reign of terror in California, raping and killing 10 girls between the ages of 12 and 28, and then strangling each victim in the hills above Los Angeles. So you'll see a common theme here, the 1970s California. Then you've got the BTK killer, Dennis Rader, who murdered 10 people. Now, it wasn't in California, it was in Kansas, but it was in the 1970s. He was obsessed with notoriety. He wanted to be famous like Manson and the rest of them. So he would send letters trying to taunt police with the name BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill. So, you know, once again, that's the 5th one in a row that is in this same era of the 60s and 70s. Then in 1969, you got a guy by the name of Gaskins who began killing a series of hitchhikers that he picked up while driving around the highways of South America. So this is the first one that we see that's not in the U.S., but it is in the 1960s. And he claimed to have killed at least 80 or 90 people, and he always tortured and mutilated his victims. Then you have, in the 1960s through the 80s, Fred West and his wife tortured, raped, and murdered at least 11 young women in England. Now, this is the first time that England shows up, but you're going to find that that's the 2nd most common place that we see serial killers on the planet, and it's the same era, the 60s and after. After that, we have the Genesee River Killer. He first killed in 1972 by sexually assaulting and murdering a 10-year-old boy after luring him into a wooded area in New York. He then raped and killed an 8-year-old girl and was eventually convicted of manslaughter. He served 14 years in prison, and after he was released, he killed 12 more women prostitutes. So his murder spree started in 1972. Then you've got Peter William Sutcliffe, another British serial killer. So that's your 2nd one. He was known as the Yorkshire Ripper, and he was caught in 1981 and convicted, but he murdered 13 women in the 1970s, so the same era. Then you have Ricardo Ramirez, American serial killer and confessed Satan worshiper. This is the second one besides Berkowitz who confessed that he worshiped Satan. And he went on a terror in Los Angeles in the 80s. He was known as the Night Stalker. And he would break into people's homes, and then he would shoot them or stab them, rape them, and mutilate them and cut them into pieces. See, these serial killers don't just kill you. They do the most heinous, sadistic things possible. So they're clearly all totally demonized. And now he wasn't in the 70s, but he was shortly after, right? 1984. And so what I'm trying to show here is that the serial killer era began more or less in the 60s and really grew in the 70s and has just risen ever since. And notice again where he did his killings, Los Angeles, California. Number 11, you have the Milwaukee cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer. Now everybody knows Dahmer. He was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, murdered, and dismembered 17 men and boys, usually between the ages of between 78 and 91. So his killing started in 1978. Now it wasn't in California, but it was in the U.S. You're going to find that the U.S. and England are the two number one areas. Now he's the first guy who killed men. So far we've got 10 serial killers. All of them are killing women. This guy is the first one who targets men, so that makes him a little unusual. Number 12, the British equivalent to Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis Nielsen, homosexual killer who killed 15 gay men in London, England, starting in the 70s. He dissected their bodies and burned their flesh and flushed them down the toilet. And so there's the third serial killer we see from England. And we also see that it started in the 1970s. So you're beginning to see a theme here. Then there's the famous Ted Bundy. He was an American serial killer and rapist, also a necrophiliac. He confessed to having sex with the women after he killed them. And Ted Bundy did all of his killings starting in the 1970s. Now his was in Chicago, so it wasn't in California, but it was in America. He would seduce victims in a public place. He was very charismatic. He'd lead them back to his home, and then he would sexually assault them, kill them, and then decapitate them and keep his heads as trophies in his apartment. So you see, once again, this really disgusting perversion and sadism. Number 14 is Charles Ninge and his accomplice Leonard Lake, who raped, tortured, and murdered between 11 and 25 victims in at a lake ranch in Calaveras County, California, starting in the early 1980s. They would abduct them, torture, and murder entire families at a remote cabin in Northern California and make them sex slaves. These guys terrorized potentially dozens of people in their makeshift bomb shelter in preparation for a nuclear holocaust that would require them to repopulate the earth. One of the things you're going to see about Satan is, and all of the occult and the New Age movement is, they're always into the apocalyptic stuff. Marjorie Cameron was convinced that the apocalypse was coming and that Mexico was going to destroy America and that there was going to be a meteor hit. It was at the end of times. And Aleister Crowley talked about that stuff a lot. And you'll see that also with a lot of the UFO religions that we're going to look at are all they're apocalyptic. And when we get into the New Age movement, you'll see that there's a lot of that ideology there as well. But where you'll see it the most is in the UFO movement. All the people who are abducted by extraterrestrials, usually when they give their testimony, they're told that the aliens are telling mankind that we're getting close to the end of the world and the apocalypse, and that they're here to help. So you see a lot of apocalyptic stuff with these cults. So that's another one. Charles Nigg and Leonard Lake were also in California in the early 80s. John Wayne Gacy. I misspoke. Actually, Ted Bundy was not in Chicago. That was John Wayne Gacy. Ted Bundy did his killings all over the country. He started off in California, and then he moved to Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Oregon. He was all over. But he did do killings in California in the 70s. Now, John Wayne Gacy, he sexually assaulted and murdered 33 teenage boys and young men in a series of killings between 72 and 78 in Chicago, Illinois. And so he would lure victims to his home with the promise of work or money before murdering them by strangulation with a tourniquet of all things. So what do we see common here? Well, we see it in America. We see in the 1970s he goes on this killing spree, and he's another one that targets men. And most of the people who've evaluated these serial killers feel that the heterosexual men usually target the women, and the homosexual men usually are serial killers of men. But once again, this is another one in the 70s in the U.S. Number 16, Chikatilo was a Soviet serial killer nicknamed the Butcher of Rostov. He committed sexual assault, murder, and mutilation of 52 women and children in Russia starting in 1978. So same era, different place. Then we have Tommy Lynn Sellers, who claims to kill at least 70 people. He's one of the most dangerous offenders in Texas and convicted of over 13 killings starting in 1985. Then one of the United States' most prolific killers, Gary Ridgway. He was arrested in 2001 for murders that he confessed of 70 women in Washington State starting in the early 80s. Then we have Pedro Rodrigues Filho. He was a Brazilian serial killer. He was arrested in 1973 and convicted of 71 murders, so he probably started his killing spree in the 60s and 70s. Then we have Barbosa, who was a serial killer who had raped and killed over 150 young girls in Colombia and Ecuador during the 70s and 80s. So now we're picking up a couple guys in the Central America, South America area. But none of them were before the 60s. Every serial killer that I researched started in the 1960s, and then it picks up in the 70s and 80s. Number 21, Pedro Alonso Lopez, another Colombian serial killer, accused of raping and killing over 300 girls in South America in the 1970s. Charles Manson and the Manson family, responsible for the Tate and LeBlanc murders, 1960s. Ian Brady and Myra Henley killed 5 children. They would target young children, kidnap them, and kill them between 1963 and 65 in Greater Manchester, England. They also sexually assaulted the children before they killed them. Then you have the Zodiac Killer. That Zodiac Killer is the pseudonym of an unidentified serial killer who operated in Northern California from the late 60s to the early 70s. He murdered many victims in San Francisco during 1968 and 69. That was the Summer of Love. And the Zodiac himself claimed up to 37 victims. And the killer originated the name Zodiac in a series of taunting letters that he sent to local Bay Area press. And these letters included cryptograms or ciphers. That kind of reminds me of the sigils that we saw with some of the bands. And then number 25, charismatic Jim Jones, who originally established the California-based People's Temple in Redwood Valley, California in 1966. So, what we see is that there's a lot of serial killers that started in the 60s and 70s in America, and especially California. And, and then also another prominent area was in England. So we're going to spend just a minute talking about Jim Jones, because this is probably one of the craziest situations that we see. We have reason to believe that Jim Jones hung around the same circles as those in Scientology and the Process Church. He had a temple in Redwood, California in 1966, and he was really in that California period during that heyday, if you will. And later he moved his entire church to a place called Jonestown, which was an agriculture commune that he had purchased in Guyana, Africa. And this was in the 1970s when they moved there. And he's responsible for the mass murder-suicide of over 900 people, including 304 children. In the end, he persuaded his entire church congregation to drink the Kool-Aid that was filled with cyanide. And that's where we get the expression today, don't drink the Kool-Aid. So, according to Adam Lusher from Independent Magazine, survivors recall, quote, "After a dinner of rice, gravy, and wild greens, it was time for Russian language lessons because Jones preached that the Soviet Union was a paradise on earth whose leadership helped liberation movements. Jones would also read everybody literature about Marxism. And I think this is interesting because if you've studied communism, it's a highly sadistic organization. Communism was really birthed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's really one of the main things that sparked World War I and World War II, which was responsible for the death of 50 million people and more. When you look at places like communist Soviet Union and communist China, they have red as on their symbols. And when you read Karl Marx's principles, he says things like abolishing religion, abolishing the family, abolishing private homes and residence, private property. It's really just this. It's like a beehive mentality, where you have the queen bee, and then you have all the drone bees who live in their cubicles, and it's worse than a socialistic system, but it's a lot like a socialistic system in that there's just two classes. There's the 1% elite, and then there's the second class, which are just the worker bees or the worker ants, if you will. But this guy, this cultist, was fascinated with Nazi or with the Soviet Union. And what you're going to find throughout this lecture and others is that all of these cult killers, all of these occultists, all of the people who are into the witchcraft and the mysticism, they're either into Nazism and fascism, or they're into communism and the Soviet Union. So continuing on, Jim Jones suffered from insomnia, many strokes, temporary blindness, and would often have violent convulsions. Now that's consistent with what I've said in the past. That people are highly demonized will experience central nervous system disorders. And here's another patient that we're seeing having convulsions and mini strokes. That's clearly neurologic in origin. And he was taking Valium and synthetic morphine. And Valium is a sedative hypnotic. So I'm sure that had a big influence on him. Miss Wagner Wilson, who joined the church with her family in her early teens, stated, "This was the late 60s during the love and peace movement. A lot of drugs, which my sister Michelle became involved in. Acid, LSD. Once we joined the temple, I felt like I was going to make a difference in the world. I loved it." Jones, the paranoid father figure, instructed his flock to tell on each other. Children told on their parents. Mothers and fathers betrayed their children. That sounds a lot like the Soviet Union. That's how they did it as well, and the Nazis. Eventually, the entire church relocated to Africa, where escape from the camp complex was impossible. They had armed guards of the temple security would patrol all the exit areas, and the watchtower, also known as the playground, was erected. Those who did try to escape were taken to the extra care unit. Here, a man by the name of Cahill remembers that the patients were drugged senseless, and they emerged unable to carry on a conversation. Their faces were blank, as if they had been temporarily lobotomized. You can only wonder what they had done to them. It was probably SRA, satanic ritual abuse, that Joseph Mengele invented in World War II, where they create a multiple personality disorder and DID, dissociative identity disorder. And we're going to get into the DID and Joseph Mengele when we get into the Nazism movement. But eventually, Congressman Ryan showed up to Guyana along with other journalists, and he ended up being shot and murdered. They shot him over 20 times, and so this raised obviously a huge ruckus. And this was this was the beginning of the end. But 2 survivors had the luck to be sent by the leadership to get food in the morning, and they escaped. And they were told to go to the Russian embassy in Guyana's capital, Georgetown, carrying a suitcase full of $550,000 in cash and letters leaving all of the temple assets totaling more than $7.3 million to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So Jim Jones realized that the game was up, and he sent his people with all of the cash money. Here he is living in Africa with his church, and he's got $550,000 in cash in a suitcase and $7.3 million worth of assets that he built up starting in the 60s and 70s back in the States. Just like Scientology, all these people come into the church, they're just trying to find truth, they're just trying to find God, and then you got a mesmerizer like Jim Jones, who has a supernatural, powerful, territorial spirit working behind him, As soon as you walk into that church, that's a sin. That's idolatry. You know, the Bible says don't do it. And so since those people were too naive to pick up their Bible and learn what it had to say, they decided to go out and get invited into Jim Jones' church or to Ron Hubbard's Scientology or to Grimston's Process Church, whatever. And when they walk into that church and then they voluntarily go through the ritual, that's when the demons enter, because they've given the enemy the keys to their house. And now the strong man, as the scripture says, now the strong man comes in and binds you up, and it's now producing a stronghold. That's what a strong man does. Strong man is a demon or an entity that you invite in. You don't know you're inviting it in because you're too naive to even believe in such a thing. But by being in that church and doing those rituals, you invite the demon in, and he's called a strong man because he's stronger than you. And then that produces a stronghold, where it's got a hold of you in a way where it's got power over you, and you do what it wants you to do. So I'm going to rip through this quickly. Remarkably, after the massacre, an audio tape was discovered of the final meeting in the pavilion. On it, the occasional cries of babies can be heard, along with the presence of armed guards with semi-automatic shotguns and pistols. Jim Jones tells his people that the departure of Congressman Ryan is only the start, that they won't leave us alone. They're now coming back to tell more lies, which means more congressmen. There's no way we can survive. My opinion, says Jones, is that we be kind to the children, and we be kind to seniors, and we take the potion like they used to take in ancient Greece, and we step over quietly, because we're not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act. One elderly woman did dare to dissent. What about going to Russia, she asked. It's too late for that, said Jones. But the woman persisted. I look at all the babies, and I think they deserve to live. I agree, said Jones. But what's more, they deserve peace. Please get us the medication, said Jones. It's simple. There's no convulsions with it. Don't be afraid to die. And then a woman spoke up and said, There's nothing to worry about. Everybody keep calm, and the oldest children can help love the little children and reassure them. They're not crying from pain. It's just a little bitter tasting. They're not crying out of any pain. So here's this woman who's so brainwashed that she's telling the older 8, 9, 10, 12-year-old children to go and be with the 3, 4, 5-year-old children, and she's telling them there's not going to be any pain. But they found that there was a lot of cyanide is very painful. It's a neurotoxin. It causes convulsions. Each of the members were found with their mouths full with blood, saliva, and vomit. So it was a horrible way to die. Some mothers still willingly took their children to the vat of poison before drinking it themselves. Now remember, some of this was caught on video footage. Other infants were snatched from the arms of their mothers. Parents and grandparents began to sob hysterically as they watched the children die. But one follower took the microphone to assure his fellow disciples, the way that children are laying dead now, I'd rather see them lay like that than to see them have to die like the Jews did, which was pitiful. And the ones they take captive, they're going to just let them grow up and be dummies like they want them to be, and not socialists like the one and only Jim Jones. Thank you, Dad. Can you imagine being so entrenched in a cult and having such a supernatural, powerful spirit working in your life that little kids and people are drinking cyanide and vomiting up blood, and meanwhile you stand up and say, hey, you know what? Let's thank Jim Jones, our hero, and you called him Dad? I mean, it's really insane. People have a hard time with this. They say, well, they were just brainwashed. You got to understand, this is more than brainwashing. This is spiritual. These people were demonized. So finishing up, they gave this man a round of applause, and as the baby screamed in the background, Jones admonished the faithful, die with respect, die with a degree of dignity, stop this hysterics. This is not the way for people who are socialistic communists to die. We must die with some dignity. That's right, said one of the followers. Jones himself, by the way, he didn't drink the Kool-Aid. They found the 47-year-old preacher with a bullet wound to his head. Possibly murder, perhaps more likely suicide. I don't believe anybody murdered Jones. If you can talk 900 people into killing themselves, just the same way that Hitler talk the entire country of Germany and supporting, throwing millions of bodies into incinerators. It's the same mesmerizing spirit in both of them. If he can talk 900 people into killing themselves, I don't think anybody killed him. What it comes down to is he's a coward, just like all these kids who go into schools and shoot up all these people, and then they kill themselves. They never go out in a burning blaze of glory, fighting the cops and letting the cops kill them. They go in and kill all the innocents, and then when the cops show up, they shoot themselves. It's the same story with Jones. He saw all these people vomiting up blood, and he saw how bad the cyanide was, and he thought to himself, I ain't doing that, so he shot himself. But to the very end, he encouraged others to drink the poison. It is his voice that can be heard at the close of what has become known as the death tape. Some people, so this is his final words. Some people assure these children of stepping over to the next plane, Jones commands. We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world. That's a oxymoron right there. He says we didn't commit suicide, and then in the very next sentence he says we committed an act of revolutionary suicide. So which is it? Did you not commit suicide, or did you commit suicide? And so, anyway, I wanted to cover that because I wanted to demonstrate the power of the enemy. If you can have this kind of power over human beings, is it any wonder that they're going to reject the Bible when you try and witness to them? Because it says in the scripture that Satan has blinded the eyes of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light and truth of Jesus Christ, who is the image of God. Jim Jones was a very charismatic man. He kind of had that Elvis Presley look. He always wore dark glasses. He never wanted you to see his eyes, because the eyes are the windows to the soul. And he wanted to hide those demonic eyes. But take a look at these pictures. I mean, can you imagine rolling up on this scene? 900, almost 1,000 human beings who are dead, who have vomit and blood coming from their mouths, a third of them children. And one man did this. And that man was into all kinds of occult stuff. He was into the occult, he was into mysticism, and he was into witchcraft. This goes to show you the power of this. Witchcraft is real, sorcery is real, the occult is real, Scientology is real. People are really in these cults. All of Hollywood are in these cults. You had a whole generation of people in the process church. So, moving on. So real quickly, I just want to kind of review this serial killer era. We really see it come onto the scene in the 1960s and 70s, predominantly in the United States. And if there was going to be a subsection of the U.S. where it was most common, it's in California. Now, I think you know where I'm going with this. I've been demonstrating all of the crazy, heinous, sadistic, occult, mystical, satanic stuff going on in California right up to the 60s. And so I think that triggered it. But as we're going to move on in this lecture, you're going to see how the music really played a role. Now, the second most common area was England. England was a very powerful occult area. And then the third was Central and South America. Now, predominantly it was women that were raped and murdered, but there were times as well when it was men. And it wasn't just your standard everyday killings. These people were murdered, brutalized, stabbed to death, quartered, heads were put in freezers, necrophilia. It was just really, really sadistic. Now, I got to thinking about England, the fact that England is one of the areas that are really steeped in the occult. Going back to John Dee, who was one of the world's famous occultists and alchemists for the advisor to Queen Elizabeth, and Edward Kelly was the spirit medium who worked with John Dee to help develop what's called the Enochian language, which has to do with fallen angels and the Book of Enoch, and it's a pretty crazy system that Aleister Crowley ended up jumping on the bandwagon. But you have Annie Besant and Alice Bailey, who are two of the most important women in the New Age movement, who channeled many, many books. And Alice Bailey started a publishing company called Lucifer Trust, and she worshipped Lucifer, and all of her writings ended up being used in the United Nations Charter. So when we discuss the United Nations later in the New Age movement, we're going to discuss Annie Besant and Alice Bailey. These are absolutely famous women who wrote many popular books, like Externalization of the Hierarchy, which is a famous New Age book that's almost a contemporary with The Secret Doctrine that was written by the Russian theosophist Blavatsky. So, and then, you've got guys like Aleister Crowley. I mean, we've already discussed that I kind of use him as the godfather of this whole 100 years Book of the Law era, and he was from England. And then Kenneth Grant, his successor, was from England. And then guys like David Bowie. Most people only know David Bowie from his music, but he was a hardcore occultist. And we're going to learn later that there's a bunch of bands that are from England, including Genesis P-Orridge. So, I don't think it's a coincidence that you have all these occultists and spiritists and magicians who set up shop in England, and that spirit just moved generationally from group to group to group. And then, of course, England is where, America basically is the child of England, if you will. The mantle that England had has been passed down to America in terms of occultism. And so we just see a lot of interesting commonalities there. So now I want to get back to the music. I want to get back to Genesis P-Orridge. Now, if you remember, she was an English singer-songwriter, so she's from England. She's a musician, an artist, and an occultist. She was heavily influenced by the Process Church and is a student of theremin, which is Aleister Crowley's religion. And she's the one who developed fame as the frontman of acid punk industrial band Throbbing Gristle. She identifies herself as a third gender, and the themes of her music involve sex, pornography, serial killers, and occultism. Now think about that for a second. She was very famous in the 70s for her music, and she started industrial music, which is what's called the music of Electronica, the age of Electronica. And we're going to get into that more deeply. So, she started off as a boy, and she became a woman. She channeled a very detailed book called the Psychic Bible, and this became her own personal symbol, which she also channeled through automatic writing. So it's a sigil, and these are some pictures of her over here on the right with the upside down cross on her chest, and you see her left shoulder there. She's got the circles inside of the circles because she understands the concept of opening up doorways to higher dimensions. Now here's another English occult group, and they were founded in 1982. Their name is Coil, and they were former members of Throbbing Gristle with Genesis P-Orridge, so they're a splinter off of her. She was a splinter off the Process Church. The Process Church was a splinter off Scientology. Scientology was a splinter off Aleister Crowley. And so the Process Church led to Genesis P-Orridge. And now she's led to this group called Coil, who at one point were part of the Temple of the Psychic Youth. So if you look at the bottom, Coil's on the left. This is the band we're going to discuss. And the Temple of the Psychic Youth is on the right. Coil used to be members of this band. And what do you see on their shirts? Charles Manson, because they're obsessed with serial killers. They're obsessed with sex. They're obsessed with cults. So this group, Coil, are strongly influenced by Aleister Crowley. They refer to themselves as born-again pagans, and the lead singer said that their music is more like magic rituals than it is musical pieces, and he refers to it as magical music. And notice how he includes the K, M-A-G-I-C-K-A-L. That's how Aleister Crowley wrote magic. Kind of like how the Red Hot Chili Peppers have the band called Sex Magic. I forget the name of it. It's Blood Sugar Sex Magic. And it has songs like Californication. This is not a coincidence. When you look at the way the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who by the way are hardcore into the occult, they talk about blood, sex, and magic because they're into the sex and blood magic rituals. And the song Californication is talking about making the parallel between California and fornication and pornography and idolatry. So they understand all this. But so Coil says that their music is really magical music. And if you recall, we went through this on the last lecture. I felt it was important enough to bring it through again. Their distribution techniques are such that they would release a limited number of albums to make them collector's items, and then they would include art objects, blood stains, and sigil-like autographs. Now we talked about art objects. They're these little, they doodle and make these little objects, kind of like the symbol that he has down here on his chest. They make these little symbols when they're doing this transcendental meditation, so they're channeled symbols. And then they'll include those in their art cover. They'll put blood stains in there, which we know the demonic love blood. Blood excites them. That's why people who are demonized cut themselves. And then when the blood comes out, I mean, that's why there always has to be a blood sacrifice with a satanic ritual. That's why all these serial killers had to do such heinous, they had to chop these people up into pieces, because you got to have as much blood as possible, because the life is in the blood, and the demons feed off of fear and sex and blood. And so these guys include stains of blood in their music, in their albums. And then they put their autographs, these sigil autographs, in the packaging. So they really tune them up and charge them up. And they actually admit here that it's more of like an occult artifact than a CD. And so their music is based on chaos magic, which combines Wicca, Kabbalah, and Aleister Crowley's Golden Dawn system. It uses Hinduism and tantric practices to achieve a Gnostic state of altered mental consciousness through self-hypnosis and other things like trance-inducing drugs. They also try to reach mindlessness through intense arousal via sexual excitation, flagellation, chanting, and drumming. And then another technique is they randomly draw or doodle sigils. And then Aleister Crowley taught that a sigil is a glyph or symbol that represents an intention. And he says that the sigil becomes charged. And in medieval times it was considered a pictogram or the signature of a demon. Now, according to Crowley, a sigil was used to call into action an elemental force. An elemental force is a fancy way of saying a spirit or a demon. And that Crowley taught that you can use a sigil to seal a talisman. So a talisman is where you do a satanic ritual over an object, and you put all that demonic energy into that object, and then to keep that demonic energy from leaving the object, you have to seal it. And so you seal it by putting all of these little symbols all over it, and that's a sigil. That seals it. And that makes that thing very occult. And then the person who buys that object, when we were in New Orleans one time, we were down in the voodoo area, and we were walking through the shops, and they had all of these amulets and all of these charms and magnetic, crystal bracelets and things. And I just knew, I mean, there was occult stuff everywhere, and I thought to myself, man, this thing is there's so much powerfully charged stuff in this thing. And that's going to open you up to demonization, nightmares, like a dream catcher. A dream catcher doesn't catch your dreams. A dream catcher, if you look at it, circles within circles with a mandala in it, that is how you open up a doorway to a higher dimension. And so all of these little charms and everything, like the Bible says, they're charms and enchantments used to enchant you and deceive you and mesmerize you. Now I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to warn you, things are about to get complicated. And you may, there may be a moment where you're like, why is he talking about all this stuff? But it's just, this is so important that you get this next part, because it's really deep, it's very sophisticated, it's very demonic, it's very occult, and it's very supernatural. And what it is the invention of electronic music and industrial music, and how it all came about. And so this group Coil that we've just been discussing, they have incorporated many exotic and rare instruments into their recordings and performances in order to enhance the magical and alchemical process of the music. Okay? So they've chosen these specific musical instruments because they have a purpose. And the purpose of the instruments are to do what they just said. It enhances the magic and the alchemical process of the music. So that means that there's something magical about these instruments, as I'm going to demonstrate. Now, the group has expressed particular interest in modular synthesizers, including the Moog synthesizer. And we're going to go into what a modular synthesizer is, but you should already be suspect if this deeply disturbed and occult group has expressed particular interest in these synthesizers. There's something about them that they're drawn to. There's something of an occult nature that they recognize in these instruments. Now, they're one of the few artists who've been granted permission to use the one-of-a-kind ANS photoelectronic synthesizer. This ANS synthesizer is a really amazing instrument that was created by an occultist from communist Russia, and we're going to go into it in great detail. But it's not a coincidence that this group got access to this instrument to produce some of their music. We'll discuss that in a minute. One of the other instruments that they commonly use in their music is something called a theremin, okay? A theremin, and it's also a modular synthesizer. It's also known as an ether phone, which we'll discuss on the next slide. So I want to get into this ANS synthesizer and explain its origins and what it is. So in 1938, you had a Russian engineer by the name of Murzin. He created the ANS synthesizer, which he named after his mentor, the famous Russian pianist and composer Alexander Nikolaevich Scriabin. Now, Alexander Scriabin was an occultist and a theosophist. So that tells you a lot about him already. He's a Russian. I haven't spent a lot of time breaking down theosophy, which I'm going to do when we get into the New Age movement. But theosophy was started by a Russian woman by the name of Madame Blavatsky. Okay? So Blavatsky was born in the 1800s. She passed away in the late 1800s. And she is the one who came up with all the doctrine about the 6 root races, the Aryan race, the Christ consciousness. All of that New Age material flows out of the Theosophical group and Blavatsky. Then many people jumped on that bandwagon, including Aleister Crowley, Nicholas Roerich, and many, many others. Well, this guy was just another victim of it. Alexander Scriabin was an occultist, and he studied Blavatsky's writings like The Secret Doctrine, and he became entrenched into that spirit, just like the rest of them did. He didn't have the Holy Spirit, he wasn't protected, and so boom, he got sucked in. Well, now that he got sucked into this, he began to start working on his own musical system, and through mysticism, he was able to develop a substantially atonal, that means almost without tone, an atonal and more dissonant musical system. So essentially, he channeled his musical system. It came from the dark side. It is a direct reflection of the demonic realm. They inspired this in Scriabin, okay? And I will prove that as we go forward. Now, what's interesting about this guy, and this is going to come up later in the lecture, so pay attention. This guy had a medical condition called synesthesia, which is a fascinating medical problem. This is a perceptual phenomenon in which stimulation of one sensory pathway leads to the automatic involuntary stimulation of a different sensory pathway. So in his specific condition, when he would hear various harmonic tones, it would also allow him to see specific colors at the same time. Now, this didn't happen when it was just regular tones and regular music. It only happened when with his system that he created, this atonal dissonant musical system that he channeled, when he would play these weird tones, then he would see these weird colors associated with it. And that's what the picture in the bottom represents. You can imagine sitting there on the keyboard playing the music, and as you hear it in your ear and open your eyes, you see colors flowing through your visualization. I mean, that's a pretty astonishing situation. And it makes some sense because we see that kind of with the taste of smell and with food, right? The taste buds and the way your senses of your smelling the food and tasting the food, that all kind of goes together. But here now we're talking about vision and hearing
those two senses being locked together. And so it's what we're going to find out is it was during the age of communism in the Soviet Union in the early 1900s that would give birth to what is referred to as the age of electronica. And I find that really fascinating because, we've already spent some time talking about electronics. We've talked about the lightning bolt, electricity, white noise, static. We've talked about the electropsychometer and how they can measure your spirit with electronics. And now here we see the birth of the age of electronica. And I'm going to get into what that is specifically. But it's not a coincidence that it comes from the Soviet Union. If you've ever studied communism, you have to understand that communism is one of the sickest ideologies that's ever existed. If you read the principles of men like Karl Marx, who wrote the 7 tenets of communism, they believe in things like abolish the family, let the state raise the kids, abolish private property, abolish free speech, abolish religion. It's a very hardcore atheistic society. It's not a coincidence. Adolf Hitler got a lot of credit for killing, the 6 million Jews and all the gypsies and everything, but Stalin killed far more than Hitler ever dreamed of. And then you have like communist China, where Mao Zedong was the communist general of China who killed millions and millions and millions of Chinese people. And so when you look at the fruit of the communist nations, you see nothing but death and despair. And it's not a coincidence that they have their symbol is always red. China is red, and the Soviet Union is red, because that's the color of the enemy. That's the color of the devil. And so what we find is that this whole age of electronica was born. It was birthed out of communism. It was from these Russians, starting off with Blavatsky, and then this Russian engineer Mirzin, and this Russian pianist who was in theosophy, Scriabin, and also the guy who invented the theremin, the etherphone, Leon Theremin, was a Russian. And so it was during this period of time where the enemy was working through these mystical occultists, and they created this music. And it's fascinating to see this music play out, because we're going to show you how and what this music came to be. But it's been said that the ANS synthesizer translated what could be the sonic alchemy of the USSR of the Second World War. That specifically, it's a device that recreated occultist symbols and harmonies. And I'll explain that momentarily. Now, there's a author by the name of Jean Madrid who posted a very interesting article in the Metaphysics and Mysticism magazine. And the name of the article is called Alchemy of Sound on the Occult and Soviet Synthesizers. You got to understand, we're seeing the word alchemy appear a lot. And alchemy is a very important occult concept. Alchemy is the mixture of different chemicals and different products to try and produce and synthesize something that's hard to achieve. For example, in the Dark Ages, they were obsessed with mixing all kinds of base metals to try and create gold. And they did that through magical alchemy. And alchemy is where we get the word chemistry today. So alchemy, this occult science of alchemy, over centuries and centuries and centuries, became the science of chemistry. And we'll discuss that at a later time. But you're gonna see a lot of references about alchemy, which is to try and synthesize these different sounds and visualizations and the different 5 senses. They want to merge them all together. And so I like what this author Madrid has to say. The origins of electronic music via the first synthesizers were influenced by precepts of magic and the occult. The father of futuristic music, a Russian occultist and experimental composer by the name of Alexander Scriabin, inspired the creation of the optoelectronic machine capable of converting symbols sketched onto a large pane of glass into sounds. This would become known as the Soviet ANS synthesizer. So we're going to take a look at it in a minute, but basically you can put symbols, occult symbols, onto a piece of glass and sketch them on there. And then when you put that piece of glass into the synthesizer, the sketchings produces a sound. And they use these sounds to create this new branch of music. Now, Scriabin was passionate about theosophy, music, and occult philosophy. He blended many concepts such as the Nietzschean free will, the synthesis of Hegel, and the doctrine of Madame Blavatsky. So, it's kind of getting complicated here, but it's a complicated spirit, so we just have to break it down. If you study Nietzsche, Nietzsche was the German philosopher. He was a nihilist. He had a lot of influence on people like Adolf Hitler, for example. Nietzsche is the one who described, in the German they called it the Übermensch, the Superman or Overman as it was expressed. This genetically pure Germanic group of people who would become this Superman. And so that was one of the influencing factors on Adolf Hitler for wanting to create this genetic, Aryan. So there's one thing. And then it says here, Scriabin was also passionate about Hegel, the synthesis of Hegel. If you remember Wilhelm Hegel, he was another German. He was a German philosopher. He was the one who put the theory of the thesis plus the antithesis equals the synthesis. We talked about that before, about how the elites, they all believe in following the Hegelian dialectic. That's where you come up with the problem, and then you create the solution, and then you implement the solution. They call it controlled opposition. And then in addition to that, he was into the doctrines of Madame Blavatsky, who is in the Theosophical Society. Now, she is the one who invented the concept of the Aryan race. And she discussed how eventually mankind was going to evolve into this superhuman race. Now you're going to see how all of these philosophies would begin to work in Scriabin's mind. And what he did is he began to synthesize, as an alchemist of sounds, his esoteric vision using lights and sonic tones. His work Mysterium would put music to a kind of apocalyptic hypnotic ritual where he believed that man would transition from an earthly humankind to the super being. So this guy Scriabin became obsessed with something called the Mysterium. And this concept Mysterium is where he wanted to have a 1 week long orchestrated music symposium that would take place in a cathedral in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains of India. Now, obviously, he chose India for a reason, because, that's where all the Eastern mysticism is. That's where all the gods, Kali, and all of the Eastern gods are. That's where the ascended masters of wisdom are. That's where the transcendental meditation and all that was invented. So it's got a lot of power. It's got a lot of occult power there. So naturally, he wants to do this orchestra there. This week-long event would culminate in the end of the world and the replacement of human beings with nobler beings. And we're going to get into the specific mechanics of how this was going to work. He believed that if he created a combination of the 5 senses blended with his new musical system, that all of that would open up the 6th sense in human beings, which is the ability to see into the spirit, and that the Mysterium would open a door to a higher dimension for the entire bulk of humanity on planet Earth to evolve, so that after the Mysterium was complete, we would no longer be in this present time, but we would all evolve to a higher dimension. And he completely believed this. If you do a study on him, you'll find there's a lot of information about him. He completely believed this. Unfortunately, he died at 43 from sepsis, and he was never able to carry out the Mysterium. Now, Wikipedia has some information on the Mysterium. It was an unfinished musical work that Scriabin spent a large portion of his life working on. Scriabin planned that the work would be synesthetic. Synesthetic, that means that it blends those senses together, exploiting the senses of smell and touch as well as hearing. He wrote that there will not be a single spectator. All will be participants. The work requires special people, special artists, and a completely new culture. The cast of performers include an orchestra, a large mixed choir, an instrument with visual effects, dancers, a procession, incense, and rhythmic textural articulation. You can see here that he's putting things in that will affect everything. Instruments that have visual effects so that your eyes are being mesmerized. And then, of course, you're listening to his music because it's his symphony that he's playing from his occult music, so your ears are being mesmerized. And they're going to be, injecting incense into the air, and which is an Eastern mystical, thing that they do in Buddhism and Hinduism. And the incense is going to have an effect on the sense of smell. And there's going to be this rhythmic textural articulation. Rhythmic meaning, almost like rave music. We're going to play some of that later, and you're going to see what it means to have rhythmic textural articulation. And so all of this is to put you into a specific occult mindset so that you can, receive the spirit, if you will. Now, the cathedral in which it will take place will not be of one single type of stone, but will continually change with the atmosphere and the motion of the Mysterium. This will be done with the aid of mists and lights, which will modify the architectural contours. Now he's got mists, which is, the sense of feeling, right? The mists are hitting you and the lights are shining, and he's really envisioning something pretty amazing. Now, there's more information on the Mysterium that I want to review. It was to be what today would be called a multimedia arts festival. Here's how John Bell Young described the event. Scriabin's dream was to stage the Mysterium in the Himalayas. He conceived of it as a grand purification ritual, notice he uses the word ritual, where bells were to be suspended from clouds. Thousands of participants, clad in white robes, would intone his melismatic mantras with the fervor of the dervishes. So here he's talking about thousands of people showing up. They're going to be wearing white robes, similar to, rituals always have people dressed in robes, and that they would be using their tones. That there would be a mantra, which is something that, you speak. Like we demonstrated in the past, a mantra is something like this. Ooh. So everybody's going to be involved in a mantra. Now, we already know through Eastern mysticism that when you do mantras, that's one of the ways that you clear your mind, you clear your conscience, and when you begin to prepare for a transcendental meditation, you use a mantra to clear that space in your mind so that you can allow whatever spirit guides or whatever energy from the universe to enter in. So, Scriabin, he's a studier of the occult. He understands how this works. He understands that it's a ritual and that you need to participate by doing a mantra. And then he goes on to say, expending every bit of their available energy in the service of his artistic idealism, he envisioned an orgy of the senses, and to this end he created a choreography of lights, odors, colors, and exotic dances. This was to have gone on for one entire week, culminating in what he referred to as the apocalypse and the end of time. Scriabin believed that the performance would culminate in the annihilation of space and time and the utter melting of reality. So what he's talking about here is doing such a huge ritual on such a huge level that it wouldn't be like the ritual that, Aleister Crowley and Roddy Minor did in 1918, the Amalantra working ritual, where they did claim that they opened up a window in space and time and allowed Lamb in. That was a small ritual. It wouldn't be even on the level of Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons when they did the Babylon working ritual, where Crowley said they made an even bigger hole in the fabric of space-time. No, we're talking about a ritual on a tremendously higher level that involves thousands of people. It's in the Himalayan mountains, which is going to be a very charged region due to all the Eastern mysticism. And then he's incorporating all these different sounds and all the different five senses. But don't forget, he's also incorporating this musical system that he invented, that was dictated to him, that was channeled to him from a higher power source. And when you put all this together, It was going to open up the mother of all doorways that would actually cause space and time to collapse on itself in such a way that our three-dimensional time-space would no longer exist, and therefore we would all have to be elevated to a higher dimension since that dimensional space was destroyed. So it's a pretty complex and sophisticated ideology. But he would go on to say that thus transcending the physical world and ego itself would dematerialize and man would be reborn as pure concept or consciousness, even went as far as to purchase a plot of land in the Himalayas, fully expecting to realize this event. The writer of this article says the apocalyptic vision seems to be plucked right out of Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, which predicted that modern humans would be replaced by a more evolved race. That was one of the things that was affecting him. You know, Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society are the ones who had such a profound effect on people like Aleister Crowley. He adopted that, and he added his own stuff to it. He added Hermeticism to it and created his own Church of Thelema. But, you know, she was really responsible for the shaping and molding of many people's minds, including Adolf Hitler, etc. So, you know, over here on the right, you can see a portrait that was done with Alexander Scriabin's name on it. It's called The Poem of Ecstasy and Prometheus. Prometheus was one of the Greek gods who, according to Greek mythology, he was a demigod, and he actually introduced fire to mankind. Now, we discussed when we were going over the chapters of the Nephilim, if you remember in the book of Enoch, it says that the fallen angels revealed all the secrets of heaven to mankind, including things like how to mix roots, how to observe the signs in the sky, the sun, the moon, astronomical and astrological signs, the zodiac, all of that, how to make weapons and so forth. So this whole concept that these Greeks have that, you know, that these Greek gods are the ones who introduced these things, that's based on a kernel of truth. But here we have an image that this is sort of the representation of the Mysterium, if you will. And you can see that there's this large sun god, if you will, and he has angelic wings behind him, and the sun above his head. And you know, in the bottom, you can actually, if you look close, you'll see a six-pointed star with a black facing down triangle and a lighter colored facing upside up triangle inside of a circle. So we know that that's, you know, the hexagram inside of a circle is one of the predominant symbols that are used in witchcraft and sorcery. And so you know, I think that that's a good artistic expression for this Mysterium. And so I just want to finish off by including that, you know, this guy was bent on creating this ritual that was going to shatter the boundaries of space and time, if you will. Well, compare that to what Crowley and those believed. You know, Jack Parsons, who joined Aleister Crowley's church in the 1940s, he came to believe in the reality of Thelema magic as a force that could be explained through quantum physics. Later, he and Hubbard would say that the purpose of the Babylon ritual was to shatter the boundaries of space and time to help usher in the Eon of Horus. So, you know, we've discussed how the enemy works in a lot of different ways and that this is all layered. And this is just another layer of the deception working through this guy Scriabin. But it's going to be really important to see how his music moves forward from this moment on and what it leads to. So we talked about Scriabin, so let's move on to the next instrument that really becomes prominent. And it was invented by another Russian by the name of Leon Theremin. And he developed one of the most fascinating and strangest machines in 1928. The theremin synthesizes movement and sound, while the ANS did sound with images. So with the previous one, the ANS, you could draw images on a piece of glass, stick it into the machine, and those images would then get spit out as musical tones. This one's different. This one, you move your body, and however you move your body, it produces the sound. It's very interesting. The theremin is an electronic musical instrument which is controlled without any physical contact from the player to the instrument. It was originally known as the ether phone. Now that's really fascinating to me because We've talked about the ether. The ether is the spirit realm. That's what the New Age movement and the occultists describe as the spirit realm. When they say that they're going to make contact with an ethereal being, that means they're connecting with something from the ether. Or when they're going to astral project out of their body and they'll travel along the astral plane in the ether. So, an ether phone, a phone is something that you dial and try and connect with somebody or something. So an ether phone is basically a device that's trying to make a connection and phone and speak with something in the ether or the astral plane. So I think that's a very appropriate name for this instrument. But the sound of the theremin is often associated with eerie and spooky music and eerie and spooky situations. It became famous as the sound of alien invaders from beyond in many films such as the 1950s Rocket Ship XM and the 1951 movie The Day the Earth Stood Still. Also movies like Mars Attacks and the 1950s movie The Thing from Another World. Now I want you to think about this. We were talking about how Crowley and Parsons and those guys were doing all the rituals, and they opened up a hole in the fabric of space and time, and that's when we started seeing UFOs and things manifest. Well, that was 1940s, 1947. Now, 1947, we had the Roswell incident, which put, ufology on the map. Within 3 or 4 short years later, boom, we're now seeing in Hollywood these movies are being produced. Movies like The Day the Earth Stood Still, about an invasion of Martians. And what's interesting is, as these movies are being produced, this musical instrument just so coincidentally is being produced as well, so that it can display this eerie music in the movie. Remember, it's alchemy synthesis where they're combining different senses in order to get the effect. It's not just good enough to go sit in the movie theater in 1951 and watch The Day the Earth Stood Still in black and white without the appropriate music. You've got to have the music and you've got to have the visualization to really stimulate the effect. And so in a minute we're going to listen to the theremin on the next page. Now unfortunately on this platform on PowerPoint I'm not able to actually play the videos, and you can't physically see the videos playing, but you can hear the music. So I tried to include some pictures down below. But these are images of these different people, playing. This one on the right is theremin himself, Leon, and then in the middle is Beck, who is the Scientologist who's playing the theremin. And what you'll see is that they move their bodies, and however they move their fingers and their bodies, that represents the notes within the instrument. Basically, the instrument consists of 2 metal antennas that sense the relative position of the player's hands, and the control oscillators are for frequency and amplitude. So one hand controls the frequency, the other hand controls the amplitude. You never even touch the instrument. All you have to do is put your arms in between these 2 metal antennas, and then you can move them at any way you want, and based on how fast and the way you move your hands and your body language is what produces the sounds. So you have to actually embody the music. It's really very interesting. And so, and then as you do that, the electric signals are then amplified to a loudspeaker and projected over an area. So, this theremin became known for spooky, eerie movies, and it actually developed its niche as the ethereal sound of an approaching flying saucer used in all these movies. It later became very popular in rock music. It's not a coincidence that the Beatles were one of the first ones to pick it up, and then immediately the Beach Boys jumped on it, and then naturally the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. Now, we've already spent a lot of time talking about the Beatles, how satanic they were. They were Aleister Crowley followers. They put Crowley on the front of their album. They wrote lyrics to Crowley. I mean, they were into the occult. They actually channeled the music for the White Album when they were in India, in Tibet, doing a transcendental meditation workshop. So we've already verified that. And it's not shocking that Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin was involved with this instrument either, because we already broke down, the Stairway of Heaven. It was a song that was actually dedicated to the May Queen. It was dedicated to Aleister Crowley. it was just steeped in the occult. And Jimmy Page, he had purchased Aleister Crowley's home in Loch Ness, Scotland, and he has always been a Crowley follower. If you go back several lectures ago, we show the different footage of his albums and things that have Crowley symbolism all over it. Same with Mick Jagger. I mean, we just learned today that Mick Jagger was actually part of the Process Church, him and his girlfriend, Marianne Faithfull, who starred in Lucifer Rising. So all of these people are into the same stuff. It's not a coincidence that they were attracted to these instruments and began to use them because the same spirit's working in them. Now we have a new twist here. This is the first time we're talking about the Beach Boys, and they picked up the theremin in their song Good Vibrations, which was a classic 1966 hit. And we talked about how prominent the 60s were and how the enemy really moved and advanced in that whole phase through drugs, through sex, through music, and through television. And most people don't know the different details of the Beach Boys, but there was an article written in the Business Insider by John Lynch. Charles Manson formed a friendship with Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson during the summer of 1968. The Manson family moved into his home that summer, where they all dropped acid and participated in group sex. The Beach Boys even recorded a version of one of Manson's songs. 1 year later, Manson would have his cult commit 7 murders. So, as you can see, the Beach Boys weren't innocent either. I mean, these guys actually lived with Charles Manson a year before all of the murders took place. And the more that you study them, the more that you find out that they were into all the same stuff that all of these people back in that phase were into. And there's actually a documentary that was done called The Beach Boys and Satan, which I've included over here on the bottom right. And so, if you're a Beach Boys fan, that's something that you can look into. You can watch that documentary, and it goes into many of the details of the stuff that they're into. So here is a scene of the 1950s movie The Day the Earth Stood Still that featured this musical instrument, the theremin. And here is a video of Jimmy Page playing the theremin. Unfortunately, I can't play these videos in this context, so you don't get to see them moving, but it's really interesting to watch Jimmy Page embody the music, because it's the movement that he's making with his hands that makes the instrument play, even though he's not touching it. I mean, you have to admit that it's oddly bizarre that these Scientologists and occultists are latched on to this instrument that was a product of the Soviet Union age of Electronica off of Scriabin, who was a theosophist and occultist. And here we see Beck, the Scientologist, playing it. They named it the etherphone, which has a really deep meaning to it. And in order to play the instrument, you have to actually embody it. In other words, it's almost like the music is channeled through your body, and you really should just go on YouTube and type in theremin and watch somebody play it. Especially if you do like the Ghost Sonata or something like that. But in order for the music to play, you have to put your arms between the antennas, and then your body serves as the electrical energy that the antennas are reading, so that there's a flow of electricity between the antennas into your body, which has electricity running through it, and the way that you move is what causes the eerie, spooky music to move. And what are the odds that it would be the music to the aliens of all things? I mean, it's really it's quite bizarre and supernatural. Especially when you put into context what we discussed biblically with the central nervous system and things like the electropsychometer, and how the Process Church also used the P meter in order to audit and process people. We're going to learn that the enemy works through technology,
Just because it's made out of metal and wires doesn't mean that it doesn't serve as a good medium for the spirit realm. Later, when we get into transhumanism and into 5G technology, we're going to see how that's going to be used in the last days.
Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that these movies are being produced at this time and that we have this, occult instruments that were invented by the Soviet Union occultists and theosophists, and we're seeing how these things are all coming together. The same spirit that was working in these movie producers and directors to begin making these films, the same spirit was on the other side of the planet working in the USSR, creating the music that would go with the films. And so when you look at these movies, we're going back, this is 70 years ago, the day the Earth stood still. The storyline involves a humanoid alien visitor named Klaatu that comes to Earth accompanied by a powerful 8-foot-tall robot by the name of Gort to deliver an important message that will infect the entire human race. Now this is really interesting because in a couple chapters from now, we're going to sit down and totally break down the typical alien abduction scenario. There are thousands upon thousands of people who claim to have been abducted by aliens, and they've given their testimonies, and there are several doctors who've done their dissertations with PhDs on this, and they've broken down all the commonalities of what people experience. And it's one of the things that we see is that the aliens are always giving this apocalyptic important message regarding the last days and the end of times that will affect the entire human race. So I think that's just really interesting that we see this 70 years ago in a movie. But look at some of the themes here. This movie has themes of human evolution. This movie has themes of extraterrestrials, and then also this powerful 8-foot-tall robot. So this movie also has themes of artificial intelligence. Now we're right on the brink of AI, and later we're going to get into some chapters on AI that's just going to be absolutely mind-boggling when you see some of the things that's going on with artificial intelligence and the spirit that's involved in the transhumanism movement. It's pretty fascinating, but it's just, I find it so interesting that 70 years ago, this was very prophetic that they're making movies about aliens and AI and evolution because, we're heading that direction. And so here you see the predictive programming happening way in advance. And, they went ahead and remade this movie. Keanu Reeves redid it in 2008. And it also, there's some nuances to the remake that are also very compatible with traditional alien abduction stories. This movie is where a man encounters a glowing sphere, he loses consciousness, and when he wakes, the sphere is gone and there's a scar on his hand where a sample of DNA has been taken for genetic testing. This is exactly what we're going to see when we get into the alien abduction phenomenon. 100% of people who've been abducted by aliens will tell you that they've had genetic manipulation and testing performed on them where they've had everything from semen removed, eggs, blood, and it gets pretty wild. And I'm going to save that for the ufology lecture that's coming up. But again, these movies have a lot of predictive programming. Then we see The Thing from Another World, a 1951 movie about scientists who find a crashed flying saucer with a frozen extraterrestrial in the Arctic ice who accidentally gets thawed out and then starts killing people and drinking their blood. So, you can see how, prior to the 50s and the 40s, mankind was not exposed to these things. It really wasn't in their wheelhouse. But then all of a sudden the UFO era was born. We know how it was born through Crowley's whole system at place. And then we begin to see it emerge in the movies. We see guys like Ron Hubbard, who, in the 1940s was doing science fiction books called Battlefield Earth. I mean, there's just so many levels of involvement here that it's really pretty mind-boggling. Now, this is an example of the Soviet synthesizer, the ANS, which was named and inspired after the theosophist and occultist Scriabin.
Now here's another example of the theremin instrument. And then the last one we'll do here is it's called the Ghost Sonata, which is also from the theremin. Now you might say, Dave, I think you're putting just a little bit too much thought into these instruments. You're overthinking it. But I assure you that's not the case. You have to put everything into context. We have to understand that I've already demonstrated in the last 3 or 4 lectures how music has brought about these different movements, okay? Aleister Crowley said in the Book of the Law that over the next 100 years, do what thou wilt would become the whole of the law. And we were going to see an evolution of human beings to this non-Christian value system that we see in today's world. And the way that this was going to be precipitated was going to be through music and culture and media and television. And so I've tried to show you, very thoughtfully along the way, the different processes of how this has happened, going all the way back to guys like Elvis Presley, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, and many other bands. And so now we're actually being able to see the enemy at work on the Russian connection. We're talking about men who are immersed in mysticism and the occult. That means that they're communicating with spirits and they're receiving information from the spirit realm, from Satan's realm. And they're having these ideas to create these synthetic electronic pieces of equipment. And I've already showed the connection of the electronic equipment. And then all of a sudden, as they begin to have these brainstorm of ideas to create these instruments, then the next thing you know, these instruments are being used in these scary movies to propagate this concept of aliens and extraterrestrials and things in horror movies. And so it's a very sophisticated process, and it's not a coincidence. Now, according to Clint Finley from boingboing.net, this is what he had to say. Soviet synthesizers and communism bridged occultism and electronic music. Think about that statement. The Soviet synthesizers that were developed in communist Russia were the bridge or connection from occultism to electronic music. You don't play the ANS synthesizer with a keyboard. Instead, you etch the images onto glass sheets covered in black putty, and you feed them into a machine that shines light through the etchings, triggering a wide range of tones. Etchings that are made low on the sheets make low tones, and high etchings make high tones. The sound is generated in real time, and the tempo depends on how fast you insert the sheets. You can find the occult throughout the history of electronic music. The occultist and theosophist Italian Luigi Russolo built his own mechanical instruments around 1917. The famous Moog synthesizer made an early appearance in Mick Jagger's soundtrack to Kenneth Anger's occult film Invocation of My Demon Brother in 1969. Now think about that for a second. One of the first appearances of the Moog electronic synthesizer was by none other than Mick Jagger and Kenneth Anger. Now if you remember Kenneth Anger, he's the one who did all the really freaky movies with the Crowleyan themes. And
Invocation of My Demon Brother and Lucifer Rising, that soundtrack actually was used the Moog synthesizer. Now in the late 1970s, Throbbing Gristle actually built their own electronic instruments for their occult sound experiments, setting the stage for many of the occult-themed industrial bands to follow. Throbbing Gristle was who Genesis P. Orridge. She's the one who actually started the industrial music genre, if you will. Remember, she studied under Aleister Crowley. She channeled the book called the Psychic Bible, and she's just totally immersed into Satanism and the occult. So, it wasn't just enough that she was using the Moog synthesizer, the ANS, and the theremin in her music, but then what did she do? She went and actually built her own electronic instruments for her own occult sound experiments. So you can see how this spirit, it's never satisfied. It just keeps evolving with each person as the technology evolves, and as the occultism evolves, and as the spirits evolve, the spirits become more sophisticated, and then they begin to speak and inspire more sophisticated things within the people that they're working. Clint goes on to say that it's little surprise that otherworldly sounds and limitless possibilities of synthesizers and samplers would evoke the luminous. But there's more to the connection. The aim of the alchemist is not just the literal synthesis of chemicals, but also synthesis in the Hegelian sense, the combination of ideas, solve e coagula, from the Hermetic Magi of antiquity to Aleister Crowley's OTO to modern chaos magicians. Western occultists have sought to combine traditions and customs into a single, universal system of thought and practice. Electronic music grew from a similar intellectual ground, and it all started with Scriabin, who was steeped in theosophy and the occult. That is really a very articulate way for him to write that paragraph, and I completely agree with him. He goes on there in the middle, he says that the aim of the alchemist isn't just to slap some chemicals together and make something new, but it's the synthesis in the Hegelian sense, a combination of ideas, and he uses the word solve e coagula. This is actually the inscription that's written on the arms of Baphomet. We've talked about Baphomet a lot. He's the transgendered goat. He's the hybridization between human and animal, because he's a man and a goat. He's the hybridization between angel and human. And then he's also the hybridization between male and female, anthropomorphism. So he's got three different nuances to his hybridization. And he's pointing up and he's pointing down. It's the as above, so below. What you can control in the spirit realm will manifest in the physical realm. And on his right arm he has the word solve written, and then on his left arm he has the words e coagula. And that means in the Latin solution and coagulation. And that's basically an ancient mystical alchemical motto that the alchemists of the Dark Ages and the Renaissance period would discuss. And it's a process where the component elements being synthesized into a new substance and of the heavenly, thereby manifesting into the earthly. So it's back to this the six-pointed triangle. It's this as above, so below, the henosis of spirit with man, or the macrocosm with microcosm. And so what Clint is saying here is that it's not just a matter of slapping together the five senses. Scriabin and these guys weren't just interested in saying, hey, let's see if I can get your eyes and your ears and your nose all hooked up so that you have a higher experience. No, that was the simple version, but what he really was saying is, let's see if I can mix all of your senses together and create such an occult process that I can open up a doorway to the spirit realm. And now, through the music and the visual stimulation and the mantras and everything that goes with it, you can actually have henosis with the spirit. And the music is just the medium to drive that spiritual connection. So it's quite complicated, and it's just a classic kind of concept of alchemy and the occult.
So I really think it's fascinating that Mick Jagger, who we already exposed, him, he was part of the Process Church, which was a split off Scientology. We know he was deep into Crowleyism. And I think it's fascinating that he used the it's called a Moog synthesizer, which is basically an updated version of the ANS, if you will. And he used that in the movie that Kenneth Anger produced called Invocation of My Demon Brother. And so we're going to listen to an example of Mick Jagger using the Moog synthesizer. And if you actually go on YouTube and type in Mick Jagger's Mood Trip, you can actually watch a black and white footage film of him going through the motions and making the music. It's pretty interesting. Now, put what we've learned in context with ideas like the song that Mick Jagger wrote called Symphony of the Devil. If you remember when we broke down that song, it's a song about, please allow me to excuse myself. I'm a man of wealth and fame. And the song is about Satan. It's in the first person. Satan is speaking about himself. And notice he talks about how he's caused all this horrible things to happen on this planet. But he lists two specific examples. He talks about the Bolshevik Revolution, where they stormed in and killed the czars of Russia and murdered Nicholas and all of his family, including Anastasia. And that was what actually precipitated the birth of communism. And then he also talks about the Blitzkrieg, where all the bodies began to stink. And he's referring to neo-fascism under Adolf Hitler. And so, now that I put that in context, listen to the following paragraph. The development of the Soviet electronica music combined with acid punk rock bands like Throbbing Gristle birthed a new era of industrial electronic music. And this was really birthed in the 60s. Industrial music is a genre of music that draws on harsh and provocative sounds, and it's also known as electronic music, which employs electronic musical instruments such as music synthesizers and audio signal processors, as well as electronic circuit music technology. The term was coined in the 1970s with the founding of the Industrial Records label started by members of Throbbing Gristle and Genesis Peorage. It traditionally involved themes such as fascism, sexual perversion, and the occult. Furthermore, an interest in the investigation of cults, wars, psychological technique of persuasion, serial killers, unusual murders, especially those committed by children and psychopaths, forensic pathology, concentration camp behavior, and the history of uniforms and insignia. So here we see that, electronic music started in the 60s based on all of the occult Soviet Union people who invented the instruments. Then they named it industrial electronic music in the 70s. And they were saying that the industrial music genre is obsessed with serial killers, unusual murders by psychopaths. Unusual murders would mean chopping people up in pieces, taking their heads and cutting them off and keeping them for souvenirs, sleeping with them while they're dead. And then also this genre of music is interested in cults. We've already talked about cults like the Process Camp, Jim Jones and Jonestown. Do you see how, as this music is being poured out on humanity and as this new genre of electronic industrial music which focuses on these things, I showed you how the most famous serial killers in America all started in the 60s and 70s, particularly in California? That is not a coincidence. Anybody who thinks that is a coincidence needs to really go back and look at the research and rethink their conclusions. So over time, industrial music has expanded into many subgroups or genres such as punk rock. So this is all the babies that were birthed by the industrial music genre. Punk rock, noise rock, acid rock, sludge metal, dark ambient, industrial dance, industrial hip hop, techno music, witch house music, acid rock music, death industrial, and all the death metal bands that we've heard of. You know, the Megadeth, the Metallicas, bands that I listened to for years, the Iron Maidens and the Judas Priests, all that death metal, that was all a subgenre that was born out of industrial music. Also power electronics. You got groups such as White House who specialize in what is referred to as extreme electronic music. So it's just not your typical electronic music, it's the extreme music. It's so extreme and so harsh that it's been labeled anti-music. That means the opposite of music, the reverse, if you will. This is where we see that law of reversal. You know, you've got up and Satanists would go down. You've got white and they're going to be black. You've got the right hand path, they take the left hand path. You've got normal music and they're going to do anti-music. And this White House band, who's an industrial electronic band, has been referred to as the most brutal and extreme music of all time. Now listen to what their lyrics focus on. The lyrics and the imagery of their videos, which if you watch their videos, you'll see it and you'll feel it. You'll feel the devil. You will feel this. You know, anytime you get chills, it's one of two things. When you get chills, other than being cold, if you're outside and it's cold, you'll get goosebumps. But if you're in a church praising God and they sing a beautiful song and you get goosebumps, that's the Holy Spirit. If you go into a haunted house and you feel the hair stand up on the end of your neck and you get chills, that's the unholy spirit. That's the spirit of Antichrist. And when you watch some of these bands and you watch some of their music and you see some of the imagery, you get those chills. You can feel that Antichrist spirit, that satanic spirit working. This is what their lyrics and imagery revolve around. Sadistic sex, like necrophilia, rape, misogyny, serial murder, eating disorders, child abuse, neo-Nazi fetishism, and other forms of violence. Are you seeing the connection here? People don't just wake up and when they're 14 decide, you know what? I think I'm going to start making music about sadistic sex, rape, misogyny, and serial killers, eating disorders, and neo-Nazi fetishism. That does not happen. That is something that's propagated and has been created over a long period of time, over decades. And we've been showing how it all manifested to where it is. So examples of the early industrial electronic music are a bunch of famous bands that we've all heard. Frank Zappa, Pink Floyd, Jimi Hendrix, Throbbing Gristle, Sister, Machine Gun, The Velvet Underground, Nine Inch Nails, Marilyn Manson. You know, all the bands that we grew up listening to in the 70s and even the 80s, people like Pink Floyd, you know, these were major bands that really affected people. I had lots of friends, and myself included, who used to watch Pink Floyd videos, and you know, it was all the psychedelic stuff. And you know, when you listen to it now, you recognize all of these processed synthesizers and all this equipment, this electronic equipment that goes all the way back to Scriabin. Remember, he came up with his own musical system that he channeled from the other side, and now we're seeing that playing out, you know, downstream. We've always said that the enemy works through music, and now you can see how powerful the music is. I mean, take a listen to this song, Pink Floyd, Welcome to the Machine. See, they couldn't play music like this until they developed this equipment. I mean, they had other catchy music in the past, but once we had this age of electronica develop, And this is what helped project the rock and roll movement of the 60s. And it also helped pave the way for all of the techno music, the acid rock, the rave music. For example, we'll play a clip from Covenant Dead Stars. When you watch this video, it's very mesmerizing. It's kind of like a club scene. It has strobe lights that are flashing on and off, and the music is very hypnotic. It's got this rhythm that you're moving to, and you can just imagine yourself being on mind-altering drugs in that environment. And that's exactly how the enemy's working. He's actually physically working through the music, the electronic music. Now, there are going to be people who say, no, I don't believe that, but we've already spent a lot of time talking about how these entities can enter through these electronics like the electropsychometer and all the movies and everything that show them coming through the television and this, that, and the other. And now I'm actually revealing to you that the father of the electronic age was a guy who was a theosophist and occultist who came up with this whole concept of the Mysterium, and that he basically channeled this from the other side, and then as a consequence, the Soviet Union electronic age was birthed and born out of communism, and now years later we're seeing the fruit of that. And you have to see the supernatural sophisticated spirit behind all of that. Now this is the actual ANS synthesizer. On the left you can see it. It's a big instrument, and in the center you see a glass sketching. And if you look really closely on that glass sketching, it almost looks like the crucifix. If you look closely, you can see right here is Jesus's head right here, one arm going out, one arm going out, and then look at the legs come down with the bent knees and then the feet. And so these guys were so into the occult that they would take different sketchings that they would draw. Now over here on the right is another example. This is one of the glass sketchings that they would put into the machine. So for example, you see a perfect eyeball right here in the center with eyelashes, and then just to the left of it you see a woman. You'll notice her hair running right here. That's all of her hair. Here's her face, right? Here's her eye. Here's her nose, and then if you can follow her arm down, here's her hand with her fingers. So everything on here, there's a face right here, there's a face right here, two faces actually. Here is concentric circles within concentric circles, which means opening up a vortex. Same thing here. So this page, this glass etching, if you will, it's got all kinds of symbols. It's got people's faces, it's got vortexes, it's got eyeballs. Here's another vortex right here. Here's a bunch of infinity signs right here. It's got all these different unique shapes. Here's a flower, a rose right here. And so they just sketch whatever they want. Now where it gets strange is they then put this sketching inside of the ANS synthesizer, which is an electronic synthesizer. It's got an electronic system, processing system with circuitry, and you got to plug it in, and it's run by electricity. When you put this etching into the machine, these symbols produce sounds. Every symbol produces its own sound, and it's these symbols producing these sounds that give us all of the weird, eerie, up and down machine-like sounds that would end up birthing the age of electronica. And so it's pretty wild. And what makes it even more wild is that band Coil that we looked at earlier. They flew over to Russia and actually used this machine,
And they admitted that all of their music was done from occult symbols and sigils that they had created. And we'll get into that in a minute.
Now, I find it particularly disturbing that somebody took the time to etch out the crucifixion and put it in this machine to make music out of it. I may be reading into this too much, but that's what it looks like to me. I've included a picture of it on the bottom right, and we're going to go through it on the next slide. But I just pulled some images of Jesus. This is what, if someone was going to do a sketch of Jesus Christ in the crucifixion, if they were going to pull up a sketch to have as a representation to draw, what you would find is obviously his arms are out to the side, his head is almost always turned to the right, and his legs are always bent at the knees. Now, when you study the Roman and the Roman crucifixion, the reason they bent the knees and nailed the feet into the deal is because they didn't want you to lock out your knees in order to use the strength in your legs to be able to get the weight off your hands. So you're in a quandary here. You're hanging by the weight of your hands, and it's just absolutely horrifying. And then in order to get the pressure off your hands, you've got to tighten up your leg muscles and lock out your knees and hoist yourself up so that you can take pressure off your hands. But by doing that, by hoisting yourself up, you're tearing flesh and meat on your feet. And so it makes it far more torturous to bend the knees. If you straighten the knees, if you lock out the legs, then the person doesn't have as much pain. So they wanted to torture Christ as much as possible. Then when the Roman centurions got bored with the crucifixion, they'd come along and smash your legs and break your femurs so that you didn't have the power to hoist yourself up to get another breath. Because when you're hanging like that, your diaphragm has a hard time moving, you have a hard time taking in air, especially when they thrust the spear in his side, the spear of destiny as it's referred to, the one that Adolf Hitler was obsessed with and searched the planet for. Once they did that, Jesus was having a hard time breathing, and he began to fill up his entire pericardial space in his lungs with fluid and blood. And so typically what they would do is they would walk around and they would break your legs at some point so that you could not use your lower extremities to assist yourself with the crucifixion process. But there's a prophecy in the Old Testament that says that the Messiah would not have a broken bone. And they ended up not doing this in the crucifixion. When you read the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, they did not break his legs, and that was a fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy. So it actually says in John 19, when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they decided not to break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. And then later in John 19 it says, "For these things were done, that the scripture should be fulfilled. A bone of the Messiah shall not be broken." And that's in reference to Psalm 34, which was written 1,000 years before by King David, where he says, it's a messianic prophecy about he keepeth all of his bones, not one of his bones will be broken. So that's pretty amazing. But the reason I included this is I wanted you to see the typical pictorial description of Jesus on the cross, and then I want you to look at this image on the bottom right. So let's move to the next slide. So again, I can't completely verify this, but if you look at the picture, I left the picture in the top right so you could look back and forth. Look at this guy down here in the bottom. That's obviously, whoever etched this obviously etched a person. You see his hair right here. You see his two eyes and his nose, so there's a character right there. And then to the right of that, you see Jesus' head right here, leaning to the right. And you see his arms stretched out. Here comes an arm down and up. There's his elbow right here. Here's his other arm coming down and up. Here's his torso. And then we see a leg come here and down, and another leg coming out at us and down. And there's his feet. Now, I don't see a crown of thorns, but I do see a big cross-like looking structure behind him. And so now that I put the lines in, it confuses it. But look up here in the top right-hand corner. That looks like to me that somebody etched out the crucifixion and placed it in the machine to see what kind of music it would make. What a fascinating experiment. I have no idea what kind of music that made, but I know this. The people involved with this machine are all into the dark side, so I don't imagine they were putting this on the ANS synthesizer for glorifying reasons. Imagine they were doing it from a sadistic and blasphemous perspective, if I had to guess. Here's a last look. I can't be sure. I may just be reading into the lines, but I swear that's the Crucifixion. Anyway, we're going to move on for now. Now remember I said the band Coil are one of the few bands who've had access to this instrument. It's not a coincidence that of all the bands in the world and all the bands in Russia, this one band in America was given access to fly over and use it. Why do you think that is? Because the prince of the power of this world coordinated it, that's why. And they flew over, and these are the black etchings that they did. And they put them into the machine down here on the bottom right. And you can see where it says at the bottom, Coil ANS-A, Coil ANS-B. That's the different albums. Now, at first glance, you go, whoop-de-doo. I don't see anything too fancy about it. But they admitted that they use occult symbols. And you got to remember, these guys are used to doing self-hypnosis and just doodling, just freehand doodling. They're just scribbling and doodling, and as they get deeper into a hypnotic trance, then the spirits come in, and then the spirits take over, and they start to draw what they want. So we may not be able to have a complete interpretation of these symbols, but we can know that they're all from the dark side. Every one of these are a sigil, which if you remember is a charged autograph from a demon. So I've just taken a couple of them that I identified. Here in the top left, if you compare that to Aleister Crowley's sigil that he did of Lucifer, the devil, it obviously is very similar. You see a circle with that one dot in the middle and a couple of horns. Then if you slide over to the top middle, on that previous slide, you see these circles within inside of these circles, which represent opening up a higher dimension. And then if you look at Aleister, or you look at Marilyn Manson's heart figure, that's one of his sigils. So you can see the similarities. Then if you move over to the far right, you see how Coil put a moon facing to the right, followed by a moon underneath it facing to the left. You say, big deal. But remember Baphomet. He's pointing up to a moon facing to the right, and he's pointing down to a moon facing to the left, which represents the synthesis of alchemy. And then over here on the left-hand side in the middle, you see this symbol, which if you look at that closely, it looks like a cross with an X across it. Well, guess what that is? That happens to be the cross of Scientology, which remember, these guys came from Genesis P. Orridge, and she came from the Process Church, and the Process Church came from Scientology. If you go down to the bottom left, that symbol that I have there to the right is what they refer to as the witch's foot or the crow's foot, and it's a witchcraft symbol. And then slide over to the middle on the bottom, and we see a couple, on the top we see a cross with an S in it. So I don't know if that's Scientology superimposed on the cross or Satan or whatever, but it kind of lines up to some degree with their symbol that they have, the inverted cross on the upside down cross. And then over on the bottom right, they reminded me of a lightning bolt. So then in the very, very middle, you'll see just a bunch of little scribblings and little doodlings. Each one of those were channeled from the dark side. We don't know what it means, but we do know that when they put this into the ANS synthesizer, these symbols are then going to make music, and then they're going to take that CD that was channeled through this occult instrument, and they're going to charge it with sigil-like autographs, art cover, and bloodstains, and do magic rituals over it, and then release it into the world, and human beings, unsuspecting 16-year-old kids, are going to just swing by and pick that thing up. Of course, we don't buy CDs anymore, but we did back in the day. They're going to pick up that CD and go play it. And they've now got a talisman that they're carrying around. And once they open up that music, the same thing that happened to Charles Manson when he listened to the charged music from the White Album from the Beatles, where he heard an apocalyptic message about a race war and about starting the killings, the same exact deal. Now they're being entrenched into this demonization process, and all of a sudden they're going to begin to think about serial killers. They're going to start thinking about cults. They're going to want to get it deeper into the industrial music genre, which is about neo-fascism and sadism and rape and torture and murder. And one day, little Johnny becomes something that you can't even recognize. He wakes up one day to become the Ted Bundys of the world. He wakes up to become the Charles Mansons of the world.
So I just quickly want to review what a man named Jonathan Dean had wrote in a website called brainwash.com. This is what he had to say. Occultists and electronic musicians from the band Coil traveled to Russia in 2002 to record their album ANS and the follow-up Coilins. Because, according to the liner notes, the band had only 3 days to work with the machine, they opted to etch their own sigils onto sheets and convert these into sound rather than to try to deliberately compose works. The machine was built by Evgeny Merzin, who set out to create a synthesizer capable of producing the full range of audio frequency via a unique photoelectric process. Now, the composer inscribes his visual score onto a glass plate covered with sticky black mastic. He slides it through the machine, which reads the inscribed plate and converts the etchings into sound produced by a system of 800 oscillators. Now, this is a very sophisticated piece of equipment. But remember something. Just like in the book of Enoch, it says that mankind didn't learn all those things on their own, that they learned the eternal secrets from heaven, things like, astronomy and so forth. Man just doesn't come up with these things on their own. I know that we've been made to believe that there's just really smart people who just, are just inspired to come up with these things, but they're inspired from a different place. There is a source of intelligence in this planet, and it's a spiritual source, and here we're getting an example of that because it was off of the ideas of Scriabin, the theosophist, that this guy came up with this machine. Now, the drawings operate as spare-style magical talismans, where occult symbols and the alphabet of desire glyphs representing words or phrases exist as arcane sigilizations. That's quite a sentence that Dean just said. The drawings that go into this machine, he's calling this machine a magical talisman, a big, large amulet, if you will, where occult symbols made up of different, letters and alphabets and designs, which represent phrases and words in the occult. Those are being put into this machine, and it's turning it into music. But the ANS is able to take these occult strategies a step beyond the usual by transforming them into an entirely exotic lexicon of ghostly electric frequencies. I mean, what we're basically saying is that if you could hear demonic energy working through a machine to produce sounds, this is their sounds. This is how the demonic speak with each other. You're hearing the voice of the demonic in this music. The relation of visual image to sound had the effect of a strange form of synesthesia on me as I waded through these 4 discs of unprocessed analog tones. I began to form novel mental connections between sound and vision, thoughts and symbols. So this guy is talking about his experience as he listened to the music that the group Coil produced off of this ANS in 2002. And notice what he said. He began to have a strange form of synesthesia. Now that's fascinating because the guy who kicked off this whole thing, Scriabin, he was an occultist who suffered from synesthesia, but only when it was from his own musical process. When he made the weird musical tones, as a pianist, he found these weird tones, and when he put them together, he would see colors with it, because that was the demonic entities manifesting in his life. That didn't happen on its own. Now this guy is saying, years later, here this is recent, here in 2000 something, he's listening to this music that was produced by this machine, and he's now having a strange form of synesthesia, where he began to form novel mental connections between sound, vision, thoughts, and symbols. Halfway through the 3rd disc, I had become like Nikola Tesla, obsessively listening to electronic signals, trying to pick out messages that he was certain were being transmitted by extraterrestrials. You gotta be kidding me. So we're going to get into Tesla on the next lecture, but Nikola Tesla was one of the most geniuses of the world, and he's the one who really invented everything there is to know about electricity. and what, he was immersed in listening to electronic signals because he believed that the extraterrestrials were communicating and transmitting a message to him. I find that to be pretty mind-blowing. And now this guy is saying that halfway through the third disc, he was having a Nikola Tesla moment, if you will, where he was also trying to pick out these ET sounds. Only what he doesn't understand is it's not extraterrestrials that he's listening to. It's demons. There are demons and fallen angels in the spirit realm who this machine has found a way to open up a door between us and them, and they're communicating through the machine, and that's why he feels like he's talking to extraterrestrials. It is possible for the mind to subconsciously decode this esoteric system of pulsations, throbs, clicks, and whirs. It's impossible to say with any certainty, but the mere suggestion that it might be so makes the sound entirely compelling. At first glance, the DVD animations seemed no more inventive than Winamp visuals, but I soon noticed the subtle, psychedelic abstractions present in each perfectly synchronized schema. By the end of my Coil's adventure, I was tuned into a heretofore unexplored magical current, a current that sparks and buzzes with vibrations of the manifest spirit. Electricity has truly made angels of us all. Wow. That last sentence, that was a Freudian slip right there. Electricity has truly made angels of us all. That is just very, very interesting.
And it goes on and on. I mean, you have guys like the Beatles who used the Moog synthesizer in their music in 1969, and it became such a huge hit because no one had ever heard any sounds like this before. This was a new cutting-edge sound that everybody wanted to hear. I'll play it for you right now. I mean, this was basically the Beatles recording their album on Abbey Road, which was named after Aleister Crowley. Here Comes the Sun and Because, one of their biggest hit albums that they've ever had, sold millions. You have to remember that these guys wrote this music when they were doing transcendental meditation while in India under mind-altering drugs. And these are the same guys who, the Manson family, we've already connected to all of these people. Charles Manson listened to their music, and when he heard the song Helter Skelter, he received a hidden message within the lyrics that told him to begin, everything that he did with the killings. And so, it's very complicated and very sophisticated, and you look at it and say, well, it's just technology. But as I'm demonstrating, there's more behind the technology than meets the eye. So this industrial music usually incorporates a large variety of electroacoustic music such as magnetic pickups, power amplifiers, electric guitars, and these electric synthesizers that we've been reviewing. There are many different derivatives of the music with subtypes we've already discussed: punk rock, noise rock, sludge metal, power electronics, etc. Power electronics consists of static, screeching waves of feedback, analog synthesizers making sub-bass pulses with high-frequency sounds, accompanied by screamed, distorted, hateful lyrics. Does that sound something that you want to just flip on and hang out with the family and listen to? Dark ambient is a genre of industrial music that features an ominous, dark droning and gloomy overtones, and it often has strong occult tendencies with a particular leaning towards magic, as expounded by Aleister Crowley and chaos magic, often giving the music a ritualistic flavor. Think about how they describe that. An ominous, dark droning, gloomy overtones
Occult tendencies leaning towards Aleister Crowley, and chaos magic that gives the music a ritualistic flavor. Because when you listen to it, you are doing a ritual. You don't realize it, but you are literally opening yourself up to the enemy. Dark ambient consists of evolving, dissonant harmonies of drones and resonances, low-frequency rumbles with machine sounds for the purpose of evoking solitude, melancholy, confinement, and isolation. Wow. Witch House is an occult-themed dark electronic music subgenre that includes witchcraft, shamanism, and horror-inspired artwork with hidden messages and hidden codes. It usually involves triangles and crosses and was used in movies like The Blair Witch Project and Blade. If you've seen The Blair Witch Project, that movie was scary as could be. And then Blade is the movie about the vampire. And there's a scene in the beginning of Blade where they're in a techno club and the sprinklers start spraying out blood. And then Blade shows up and he kills all the vampires, and it's got that really high-paced techno-industrial music, and it's real dark and vampiric. So it was a perfect scene. In fact, if you feel the urge, just get on YouTube and type in Blade club scene and watch it, and you'll hear the music, you'll see the pulsing of the lights, and you'll get a flavor for this industrial music. Many industrial artists have released slowed down and backmasted remixes of pop and hip-hop songs. Backmasking is a recorded technique in which a sound or message is recorded backwards onto a track that is meant to be played forwards. Backmasking was popularized by the Who? Yep, the Beatles, who used it, backmasking instrumentation in their 1966 album Revolver. So here we go. Aleister Crowley wrote this in his book in the 1920s and 30s about the law of reversal and playing music backwards because you can put satanic imagery into the music if you play it backwards. And then what do we see? We see that the Beatles, who are into Crowley, did this as well. And now we're finding out that this entire industrial music is the specific genre. It ain't country music that's doing this. It's not even your everyday just kind of soft rock and roll. It's this industrial music. These are the people that are doing the backmasking because they're into the occult and they're into the Satanism. Neo-folk, also known as post-industrial or apocalyptic folk, or dark folk or pagan folk, is a blend of folk music and industrial music that was started in the 80s. It usually involves occultism, neo-paganism, and Germanic runic alphabets. So you can see these guys there's so many subgenres now and little different pathways that they've gone with this music. It's unbelievable. I want to put things in context of what Dean just said. Let's just go through it one more time. The drawings. That's the things that the band Coil were drawing on the etched glass that they put into the machine, the ANS machine. The drawings operate as a spare-style magical talisman where occult symbols and glyphs representing words or phrases exist as arcane sigilizations. But the ANS is able to take these occult strategies a step beyond the usual by transforming them into an entirely exotic lexicon of ghostly electric frequencies. He goes on to say that halfway through the third disc, I had become like Nikola Tesla, obsessively listening to electronic signals, trying to pick out messages that he was certain were being transmitted by extraterrestrials. Do you remember what Kenneth Grant, who was Aleister Crowley's successor, had said about Lamb? He started something called Lamb Meditation and Lamb Lore. He said, Lamb is the great old one whose archetype is recognizable in the accounts of UFO occupants. Lamb has been invoked to fulfill the work of Aiwass, identified by Crowley as Satan, the devil, Lucifer, and Horus. And then lastly, Lam is the what? The transmitter and the occult energy, which is beaming vibrations and frequencies in order to manifest the Aeon of Horus. And I went on to say later that human beings we're all influenced by electromagnetic energy, and our brains are receivers or antennas. So when you compare some of that terminology with what this man just said, he said that this music has produced this lexicon of electric frequencies. And here we see that Lam is the transmitter who's beaming vibrations and frequencies. And then later he goes on to say above that, like Nikola Tesla, he was listening to electronic signals that were being transmitted by extraterrestrials. And that's exactly what he says that Lam is. Lam is the transmitter. This little green-gray alien, he is the transmitter of occult energy, and he's beaming vibrations and frequencies into the air so that those people who have a certain frequency range, those people who are in the occult, those people who don't have the Holy Spirit, those people who are involved in the things that we've been discussing, it's like when you get in your car and you start turning the radio. You've got the FM dial and you start turning the dial, and you're hearing all these different channels, and then boom, you finally come to the channel that you want. Some people, their frequency and their vibrational range is at that level because they're into the occult and they have that occult energy manifesting in their life, and boom, they start picking up this frequency and this vibration, and they get drawn into this stuff, and it's completely occult in nature.
Well, you'll never believe it, guys. I'm looking down and realizing that we're already breaking 2 hours, and what's hilarious is this was all supposed to be Days of Noah 13, and on the last one I realized I was going to have to split it up, and now it's happening again. I've got like 30 slides left, so we're going to have to stop here, and the next one will be Days of Noah 15. But I hope that this has been a good lecture. There's a lot of wild stuff that we've been going through. I'm sure there are going to be some folks who struggle with it or don't see the sophisticated aspect of this spirit. But the last thing I want to say before parting is, can you now understand why it's so important to say your prayers and to be faithful to God? You know, when you get in the car and you're driving to work, just take a minute and pray over your children. Your family and your children need to be covered by the blood of Jesus Christ and be covered by the Holy Spirit. And that way, all of this garbage that we're looking at, which is the world, you know, we're targeting these satanic groups and the industrial music and you know, the magicians and the occultists, but you're seeing that this is the prince of the power of the world. We live in the matrix and we're all plugged in. And the God of this world is the one running the matrix. And the only way we're going to get through it is by being faithful to the Lord. And so it's important to cover yourself and cover the body of Christ with prayer, because then we're protected from the enemy. You know, you see all this and it can be scary, but you have to remember that the one in us is greater than the one in the world, and that we have power over the enemy if we're walking with the Lord. So on that note, I'll say sayonara, Godspeed, and we'll see you on the next one.